Hello, this is the Dreadweaver. Prepare yourself for an evening of horrifying tales that will weave webs of terror in the darkest corners of your mind. If you're a fan of stories of mystery, true crime, paranormal, or anything that crawls in the shadows just beyond our sight, you've found the right place. This week, we're doing something a little different. There are 10 stories in this episode, but only one of them is true. Can you guess which one it is? The first person to guess correctly will have their comment pinned to the top. We'll reveal the answer in next week's episode. If you have a story to share, be sure to reach out via the details listed in the description below. If you like what you hear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. All of these actions tell YouTube you want to hear more from us. And with that, let us delve into the darkness. Story 1. You're lucky. A couple of years ago, I was working at a local gas station. At the time this event occurred, I was just promoted to key holder, meaning that I would be responsible for opening or closing the store in addition to my small pay raise. I generally worked the day shift, but my new responsibilities meant that my schedule could fluctuate depending on my coworkers' availability. That afternoon, I received a phone call from the store owner asking if I could cover the closing shift for my sick coworker. I wasn't excited to give up my night off, but needed the extra money to help save for a new car. So reluctantly, I agreed. The shift went as expected. Stocking, cleaning, interacting with customers. The night started to drag on as the hours ticked by and the flow of customers slowed down. When 10 p.m. rolled around, I was glad to start closing up shop. Around half an hour later, I was ready to head home. I set the alarm, locked the doors behind me, and headed to my car at the far side of the parking lot. Tired and dreading my shift the next morning, I promptly got into my vehicle and turned the key in the ignition. As I backed out of my parking spot, I felt a big bump, but thought nothing of it, as the parking lot was old, weather-worn, and was in need of resurfacing. I put the car in drive, and then it happened. I pulled forward and drove across a smooth stretch of asphalt toward the front drive. Thunk, thunk, thunk. You have got to be kidding me, I thought. I pulled up to the lighted area near the pumps to have a look. I walked around to the passenger side where the noise had come from. Sure enough, my rear passenger tire was completely flat. I bent down to have a closer look, sure that I had rolled over some discarded junk in the parking lot and punctured my tire. But it was worse. Much worse. My tire had been deliberately slashed. I got to my feet and started walking toward the driver's side to grab my phone when I saw a flash of movement coming toward me. A hulking silhouette raced toward me from the edge of the lot where my car had initially been parked. I practically dove back into my car, locking the doors behind me. I made it just as the figure reached my passenger door. A large man stood there, yanking on my passenger door's handle. I expected him to start breaking my window or being otherwise aggressive, but instead, he remained terrifyingly calm. His lips curled into a horrifying, devious grin. "You're lucky!" he shouted. Panicked, I put the car in drive and hobbled it out of the parking lot as fast as it would go. The man just stood there, staring, as I drove away. I took one last look in my rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of light reflecting off something metal in the man's right hand. A knife, and a very large one at that. Lucky for me, the police station was less than a mile from work, and I was able to get my car there in one piece. They searched the gas station and the surrounding area, but never found any trace of the guy. They told me I was lucky I hadn't noticed the flat before moving my vehicle, though. They believed his plan was for me to check out the flat in my original parking spot so he could ambush me. Moving my car across the parking lot bought me just enough time to escape unscathed. It's terrifying to think that if I had done anything differently, I might not have lived to tell the tale. Story 2: The Thing in the Woods. I haven't talked about this story almost since the day it happened, mostly because of the ridicule that followed discussing it. I quickly learned to keep the story of this event to myself. I was 9 years old that summer. My dad and I had been spending a lot of time at my aunt's house that year, helping her out with yard work following a minor surgery she had. Often, after the day's work was done, we would all gather around the backyard fire pit for s'mores, storytelling, and games. All in all, it was a fun summer spent making memories around the bonfire and spending time with my cousins. That is, until it happened. It was the end of summer, just a few weeks before school was scheduled to start up again. Mid-August, I believe. It had been a long day, and we were all looking forward to relaxing around the bonfire. We had just finished dinner, and the adults were sitting around the fire talking. My cousins and I decided to play hide-and-go-seek in the backyard. The house was on about an acre of land, with just over half of that making up the yard. It was an open lot surrounded by a cornfield on one side, another home on the opposite side, and a wooded area running along the back of the property. Despite being mostly open land, there were a lot of good hiding spots around the shed, various outdoor furniture, and decorations. The woods and cornfield were off limits, not that any of us wanted to venture in there anyway. In a moment of bravery, or maybe stupidity, I decided to hide as close as possible to one of the off-limits areas. If no one was brave enough to look there, maybe it would work out to my advantage. I sidled up next to an old burn barrel at the back of the property, giggling quietly to myself as I heard footsteps frantically searching all over the yard. I had been sitting there for around 10 minutes or so when I started to hear movement coming from the woods behind me. I looked up, straining to see through the darkness that was beginning to settle over us, and saw nothing. Not even the slightest movement of foliage. I assumed it was a raccoon, as they were notorious for roaming the property at night. I remained quiet in my hiding spot, peering out from behind the burn barrel. At this point, all of my cousins had been found, and now everyone was searching for me. But even as a team, they didn't dare to venture to the edge of the woods. I heard more rustling in the tree line. We lived in the Midwest, and the largest animals in our area were deer. This sounded larger, though. Much larger. Larger than any critter I had ever encountered. I remembered hearing stories about wildcats being spotted in areas further north, and started to get scared. But nothing could have prepared me for what was out there. As I stared into the tree line, something stepped forward from behind a large tree. This thing was tall, at least a foot taller than my 6-foot-something dad, and it looked sickly thin. It had long, gangly limbs and pale white skin that stuck to its frame. Its face was long and hollow-looking, and there was absolutely nothing where its eyes should have been. A surge of terror ran through me, but I was completely frozen. The creature took a step toward me and opened its mouth, bearing long, sharp teeth. It broke me from my trance, and I took off from behind the barrel, screaming my way back toward the fire in a fit of tears. Seeing me in a state of terror and fearing the worst, the adults ran toward me to find out what was happening. When I told them what I'd seen, my dad just laughed. He said the campfire stories had gotten the best of me, and that I was too old to be believing in monsters. I insisted that I hadn't imagined it, but no one believed me, even though I was obviously traumatized. For the last couple of weeks of the summer, my cousins relentlessly teased me about the monster in the woods. I didn't speak about it again for years. I have only told this story once more, when I was around 12. I had a sleepover at my best friend's house, and we had gotten on the subject of the paranormal. She had shared some creepy things that had happened to her, and I thought that finally someone would believe me. But when I told her, she too just laughed at me. She said things like that don't exist, and that I must have seen a deer or something. I was super embarrassed and dismissed her comments. I haven't talked about what happened since that sleepover, but the terror of what I saw that summer night haunts my dreams to this day. Story 3. Animal Instincts. Last week, I had a frightening experience. I was sitting in my living room, watching TV and scrolling through social media. Just relaxing after a long day. A typical evening in my house. My dogs were curled up on the sofa, the Chihuahua sprawled out in my lap, and the larger shepherd dog curled up at my feet. It was a peaceful night, and I was finally starting to get tired. Suddenly, my dogs were on high alert and jumped up from the couch, rushing to the sliding glass door, growling in a ferocious way that I had never heard from either of them before. I jumped up after them, pressing my face to the glass to see what they were so upset about. I saw absolutely nothing. I calmed them down, and we all went to bed. The next night, it happened again. It was around 11 or so when they again jumped up from the couch and charged the door with ferocity. This time, I flicked on the light to the back porch, expecting to see a wild animal running through our backyard. But again, nothing. The following night, it happened yet again. This time, I was really spooked. For the third night in a row, they were extremely upset at something I couldn't see. I flipped on the lights and peered outside at an empty yard. There was virtually nowhere for anything to hide, and I couldn't understand what was upsetting them so much. I let them outside to get it out of their system and started in with my bedtime routine. I let them back inside shortly after, and we went to bed. The next morning, I ventured into the backyard as I let my dogs outside. I watched them run around for a few minutes and then opened the slider door for them to go back in. As I went to step over the threshold, I noticed something strange. There were marks along my door frame, like someone had tried to gouge out the wood around the lock. I was shocked and stood staring for a moment. When my senses came back to me, I ran in the door and called the police to make a report. Upon searching, the police determined that there had been a break-in attempt. They found that there were marks not only on the slider door frame, but on the front door frame as well. But the most disturbing part? As they searched the yard, they found a knife that had been dropped at the back edge of my yard. I had treated it so casually, thinking my dogs were upset over a wild animal. I should have been more careful. I am so lucky nothing happened. I will never doubt their instincts again. Story 4. Followed Home. A few months ago, I had the craziest experience on my way home from work. I have a 20-minute drive from my store to my house, mostly in town with about 5 minutes of country roads in between. I pulled out of the shopping center my store was located in and noticed a large white SUV had pulled out right behind me. I didn't think much of it at first, as there are several stores in the same shopping center, and it's not uncommon for other store employees to leave around the same time I do. As we neared the edge of town, I noticed they were still right behind me. Nothing super weird, but I'm not used to seeing many people travel my way at that time of night. The white SUV was right behind me now. Partway through the country portion of the drive, The road opens up from 2 lanes to 4. I maneuvered into the right-hand lane as I was in no real hurry, and the SUV seemed to be eager to get moving. They started to pass, but when they were about even with me, they just stayed there. I looked up to see a man in the driver's seat staring at me with anger in his expression. I couldn't understand what I possibly could have done to make him angry, and I was starting to get extremely uncomfortable. I turned my focus back to the road, avoided looking in his direction, and let off the gas to allow him to pass quickly. He continued to match my speed, though, trying to keep our vehicles side by side. The end of my lane was coming up quickly, and I hoped he would move along so I could merge. He didn't. Instead, he tried to force my car off the road. I narrowly avoided leaving the roadway by slamming on my brakes. The man also slammed on his brakes, stopping just in front of me. I took a moment to catch my breath and gather myself. The driver's door of the SUV suddenly swung open, and the man behind the wheel jumped out and began running toward my car. Not willing to take any chances, I sped off and hoped the time it would take this man to get back in his vehicle would allow me to lose him. No such luck, unfortunately. Only moments later, I started to see headlights in my rearview mirror, and as they got closer, I could tell it was the same white SUV. I picked up my phone and dialed 911 as I tried to keep my distance. I explained what was happening to the operator, and she instructed me to drive to the police department in the next town, where an officer would be waiting for me. I reached the town, and every turn I made, the SUV made right on my tail, until I turned into the parking lot of the police station. The SUV sped off in the opposite direction. As promised, a police officer was waiting in the parking lot. He managed to get the SUV's license plate number and made contact with the owner. Along with camera footage from the police station, they were able to positively identify the man as the driver who followed me and tried to force me off the road. Here's the scary part. The man, a convicted sex offender, had been a customer in my store earlier that day. He waited for me in the parking lot at closing time. I thought that I had done something to upset him, when in reality, this had been his plan all along. I shuddered to think of what he had planned if he had managed to get me alone on that country road. Always pay attention to your surroundings. Story 5. The Two Friends. In my freshman year of college, I experienced something that I still have no explanation for to this day. I attended a small university with about 6 buildings on campus. One morning, I stopped by the dining hall to grab a quick breakfast before heading to class. I was waiting in line when I saw my friend Emily walking into the dining hall. "Hey, Em," I called out as she got closer. She looked up and stared at me with an empty expression. Without saying a word, she walked to the back of the line and disappeared in the crowd of students. For someone usually so bubbly and full of life, it was odd to see her like that. She usually greeted me with a huge smile and a hug. I figured something must be really wrong for her to be so checked out like that. Short on time, I figured I'd check in with her later to make sure everything was okay. I left the dining hall and walked a few hundred feet to the building next door, where my chem class was located. I entered the lobby and saw none other than Emily, arms full of books, chatting with another friend of ours. Upon seeing me, she dropped her books onto the nearby bench and ran up to greet me with a hug. Confused, I took a step back, and Emily looked almost heartbroken at my reaction. "What's wrong?" she asked. "How did you get over here so fast?" I asked her. "What do you mean?" "I just saw you in the dining hall less than 2 minutes ago," I said. "I've been in class upstairs for the last hour and a half," she said. "I just got down here right before you walked in." We both stared at each other in silence for a moment. I told her the whole story, how I called out to her and she just stared at me blankly before joining the line. "I guess I have a twin somewhere on campus," she joked. At first I thought she might be right, that I had just run into someone who looked similar and confused her for Emily. That would explain the blank stare after all. But the more I thought about it, the less it seemed to fit. I had known Emily for nearly a year at that point. We spent tons of time together, studying, hanging out, and venturing around town. In all the time I had been on campus, I had never seen anyone that resembled her, and with Emily's colorful style and unique features, the odds of finding someone that resembled her that much on our small campus would be nearly impossible. I didn't discount it completely, but it just didn't sit right with me. For the remainder of the semester, I was scanning crowds everywhere I went, but I never saw the look-alike again. Someone recently mentioned that it could have been a glitch, so to speak, but I don't know. What do you guys think? Story 6. Through the Ice. When I was a kid, my grandparents moved into a house along the edge of a lake. Their home wasn't waterfront, but instead, the lake was directly across the road, and they had their own private access to the water. They had a dock, a small fishing boat, and a decent-sized plot of land with a fire pit. We spent many summers out on that lake, fishing with Grandpa, swimming with the cousins, and roasting s'mores over the campfire. The lake held a very special place in our lives. That all changed one winter, though. My family decided to stay for the week of Christmas, as we had recently moved a couple of hours away. I was 14, and my youngest sister was around 8. The first night, my sister awoke in a fit of terror. She said she'd had a nightmare about falling through the ice down at the water's edge. My parents assured her that she was safe, and that it was too cold for us to be down by the water anyway, so she had nothing to worry about. They calmed her down, and she went back to bed. Her terror only increased as the nights went on. Her nightmares became more intense and more vivid. She said they started off lighthearted. She met a friend, they played together, and the girl beckoned her to play down on the frozen lake, where she ventured too far out onto the ice and fell through. Christmas came and went, and we only had a few more nights left with Grandma and Grandpa. We were having the time of our lives during the day, spending time with cousins we didn't see as often as we used to, cooking with Grandma, and listening to Grandpa's ridiculous stories before bed. The nights, however, became increasingly more intense. My sister had started sleepwalking during her nightmares, something she had never done before. My parents were growing anxious to get home and get her in to see a doctor, as her behavior was becoming very concerning. The last night at Grandma and Grandpa's changed everything. My dad awoke to a noise sometime after midnight and got out of bed to investigate. It sounded like the click of the front door latch, and he was concerned about an intruder. He went to the living room and found the door unlocked. He quickly relocked the door and peered out the front window to see if he could find any evidence of someone fleeing. There was a series of small footsteps leading down the front porch and across the street to the water. Standing at the water's edge was a little girl. My dad squinted to bring the figure into focus and recognized my sister's bright red pajamas. He bolted out the front door, not bothering to latch it behind him, and ran to the water's edge, screaming my sister's name. His screams woke the rest of the house, and we all came running to the living room to see what was happening. Dad reached my sister just as she stepped out onto the ice and fell through. He had managed to grab her hand, preventing her from going completely under. The shock of the cold woke her, and she was terrified. Dad ran her into the house, and my parents got her into dry clothes and sat her beside the fireplace to warm up. As she sobbed, she told them how she'd had another nightmare, and the girl was calling out to her to play. She had no idea she was acting out her dream until the cold plunge woke her. Everyone was pretty shaken up about the whole thing. No one wanted to think about what might have happened if Dad hadn't woken up when he did. Grandma and Grandpa were so spooked they considered selling the Lakehouse and moving away from the water. As much as we all loved the Lakehouse, no one ever felt quite the same about being there afterward. The scariest part came later, though. Grandma was talking to a neighbor shortly after this happened and told the neighbor they were thinking of selling the house. He asked why, and Grandma told him the story of what had happened to my sister. The neighbor's face went white, and he asked, "You do know what happened down there, right?" Confused, Grandma said that she did not. The neighbor went back into his house and returned moments later with a scrapbook of historical newspaper clippings about the history of the lakeside neighborhood. He was a local history buff and thought it would be neat to have a record of how the neighborhood came to be and notable events that had happened there. He flipped a few pages into the book and handed it to Grandma, pointing toward one specific article on the right-hand page. Apparently, back in the 40s, a young girl had drowned one winter after venturing out onto the ice. It was something she and her siblings had done every winter, but that year hadn't been quite cold enough to properly freeze the ice. The ice broke and the girl plunged into the water, becoming trapped beneath the ice. Rescuers were unable to get to her in time, and she didn't make it. Grandma was horrified. She told Grandpa the story, and that solidified their decision to sell the house. I don't know if it was just a strange coincidence or if there was something more to it, but my sister never experienced a sleepwalking episode again after that. I would love to know your thoughts on this. Story 7. Lost in the Woods. I grew up on a large property in a wooded area. There was about 1 square mile of wooded area behind my house, complete with various trails, the main one leading back to the lake. One of our trails ran through the historic railroad area, now overgrown and abandoned. This was always my favorite part of the woods, as I loved having picnics on the little old railroad bridge in the summers. I spent so much time in those woods with my parents over the years that I knew them like the back of my hand. One summer, when I was about 13, I decided to venture out on a quick walk by myself. I headed down my favorite trail toward the railroad bridge. It didn't take me long to get there, as I had been there hundreds of times before. I walked across the railroad bridge to cross the creek and continued down the edge of the river. Looking for treasures in the creek was my favorite summer pastime. Mostly I found a lot of junk, but occasionally I found some cool historic artifacts like old coins and railroad ties. I was going through my usual routine of walking along the creekside when I heard a rustle in the brush off to my right. I looked up and didn't see any movement, but spotted something large and old-looking leaning against the side of a tree in the distance. I had never seen it before, which was strange for all the times I had been out here, but I usually gave most of my attention to the creek, so it didn't seem far-fetched that I might have missed it. I decided to go check it out, as it wasn't too far off the trail. I knew there had once been a train depot in the area, so it seemed reasonable that there may still be some things left behind from that era. If it turned out to be something historic, this would be my biggest find yet. I was full of excitement as I pressed ahead. When I reached the area where I thought I had seen the object, I couldn't find anything. I was confused as I had seen it very clearly from the edge of the creek. I stopped and looked around, venturing a little ways to either side to see if I had passed it by in my eagerness to find treasure. After a few minutes of searching, I figured my eyes must have been playing tricks on me. Disappointed, I decided to return to the creek and continue my search there. But after a few minutes of walking back, the creek was nowhere in sight. I hadn't walked that far off the trail, and I was sure I was walking in the direction I had come from. but I simply could not find the creek. I started to panic, but tried to keep calm and think clearly. After a few more minutes of walking, I heard the sound of water and ran toward it. There was the creek. I emerged at the edge of a nearby lake neighborhood, which was a considerable distance away on foot. I was confused at how I could have traveled that far in such a short amount of time, but relieved to be somewhere I was familiar with. The sky seemed much darker than it should have for that time of day, but I figured we were due for rain and maybe a storm was approaching. I made my way home as quickly as possible. When I walked in the front door, my mom was crying and pulled me into a big hug. "What's the matter?" I asked. "You've been gone for hours," she said through tears. "Your father has been out searching for you, and we were just about to call for help. Where have you been?" I was confused, as I felt like I had only been gone for an hour at most. I explained to her what had happened, and she chalked up the time loss to my panicked state. I still have no idea what happened in the woods that day, or how so much time had passed without me realizing it. But I haven't ventured off the trail again, and don't plan to anytime soon. Story 8. The Black River. It was a warm night in early summer when the phone calls started. I was sitting out on my back porch around 8 o'clock or so when the phone rang. It was an unknown number. I silenced the ringer and put the phone back on the table beside me. A moment later, it started ringing again. Again, an unknown number. I sent it to voicemail. It rang again. Annoyed, I answered this time to see what was so important. "Hello?" I said. "Fear the Black River. The bottom will fall out," a deep voice growled. "Who is this?" I asked, growing more irritated by the second. The voice repeated its previous message. "Look, I don't have time for this right now. Have a nice night, buddy," I said, and hung up. I assumed it was a prank and didn't think any more of it. A couple of weeks later, I was at a family cookout. Around 8 p.m., my phone rang. The display read, "Unknown number." I rolled my eyes, silenced the ringer, and slipped it back into my pocket. It started ringing again. I half expected that, but it still surprised me to think that this might be the same caller from before. I walked to a quiet area away from my family. "Hello?" I answered. "Stop! Don't go any further," said the deep voice from before. "Listen," I yelled. "I don't know who this is, but you need to stop calling me." Silence filled the other end, and then a sharp click ended the phone call. I shook my head and walked back toward the gathering. My family questioned me, but I told them it was just a repeat prank caller, and jokingly asked if they had put someone up to it. The calls started to get more frequent. First it was once a week, then several times a week, until summer was nearing its end, and the calls started coming daily, always at 8 p.m. The phone would ring until I answered, and the voice would give various warnings each time. "Fear the Black River. The bottom will fall out. Stop! Don't go any further. Pay attention! Watch where you're going. Don't cross the river. The August skies will be deceiving." By this time, I was at my wit's end with the calls. I had spoken to the police, but they had struggled to trace the call's origin. I even changed my phone number, but the calls continued. By the time mid-August rolled around, I was looking forward to my overnight getaway, and I hoped it would help me relax. I traveled to a city a couple hours south of my hometown to meet up with some old friends. The night I arrived, we all went out to dinner, and the following day did some sightseeing around the city. It was great catching up, and it was the most at ease I had felt in months. The fear and anxiety came rushing back in a single moment that night. I had my car packed up, and was loading directions on my phone's GPS as I prepared to start my drive home. Rain poured all around me, and I was dreading the long drive in those conditions. It was just after 7 when my phone rang and the words "unknown number" flashed across the display. That was strange, as the phone calls had always come at 8 o'clock on the dot. Hesitantly, I answered. "Be careful tonight," the voice said, and the call ended abruptly. What was that supposed to mean? Was I being watched? I was now more on edge than I had been when I left home. I started my drive, and it was slow going, as the rain made it hard to see the road ahead. I followed the GPS directions and kept my eyes open for anything that seemed out of the ordinary. About 45 minutes into my drive, my GPS suddenly rerouted me due to an accident on the road ahead. I turned down the side road as directed. The road was rough and the signage was weather-worn, making it difficult to read. A ways down the road, however, one sign did catch my eye. "Black River," it said. A chill ran down my spine. It had to be a coincidence, right? I slowed my car to a crawl. A bridge came into view directly ahead. As I got closer, I could see that the bridge was gone. It had collapsed into the river below. Dumbfounded, I sat back and looked up at my GPS to see what would be the easiest way around. The time in the corner caught my eye. 8 o'clock, on the dot. I couldn't even process what was happening. Had I not slowed down at the Black River sign, I wouldn't have seen the collapse in time to stop myself from going over the edge. I did make it home safely, albeit later than what I had planned, but alive and completely unharmed. And I never received another one of those phone calls again. Story 9. The Lakehouse. Over the summer, my husband and I booked an Airbnb in a small town about an hour north of us for a friend's wedding. The house sat on a beautiful lake, and the view was incredible, especially during the sunset. We decided to turn the getaway into a vacation, as it made more sense to use our time off in one cohesive retreat instead of a couple days here and there. The house had its quirks, though, and they went almost unnoticed for the first couple of days, as we were busy with wedding-related activities. I did notice a significant number of creaks and groans, but what house doesn't have that? On our third night, though, I became really unnerved. It was storming, and the atmosphere felt tense. I had a crazy nightmare about this dark, thin, almost skeletal figure with long black hair, rising up from the lake and crawling on all fours toward the house. It ended with the figure entering the house and standing over me as I lay in bed, hands outstretched as if reaching for me. I awoke with a start, only to discover the room was empty and silent, aside from my husband quietly sleeping on the bed next to me. Realizing it had all been a dream, I took a deep breath and rolled over to go back to sleep. We woke up the next day to find a puddle of water on the floor near the back door. We cleaned it up, notified the host they had a leak, and went about our day. That night, I had the same nightmare, except this time, it didn't end when the figure reached toward me. It put its hands around my throat and squeezed, its slimy, wet fingers pressing into my skin. I struggled to breathe as I fought against it. Then I woke up, again to an empty and silent room. I felt more unsettled this time, and couldn't just fall back asleep. I decided to go get a drink of water and settle myself back into reality. I climbed out of bed and immediately stepped in a puddle. Great, another leak, I thought. I couldn't believe this house that looked so well put together could have so many issues. I reached the doorway and stopped dead in my tracks. All the way down the hall was a trail of wet footprints leading into the room. I looked behind me and saw they led all the way over to my side of the bed. The puddle I had stepped in was not from a leak. It was part of the trail. I screamed my husband's name, and he sat straight up in alarm. I told him what happened and showed him the footprints. He was convinced someone had broken in and looked around in desperation for something to use as a weapon so he could search the rest of the house. He grabbed a cast iron pan from a set we'd picked up at one of the local tourist shops. We walked quietly down the hall and out into the living room. The trail of footprints led all the way to the open back door, where a wet handprint was placed in the center of the glass. After this incident, we decided to cut our vacation short. No way in hell were either of us going to be able to relax after this. We notified the host that we thought someone had broken in that night and told him we would be checking out early. He apologized and we made our way home. That wasn't the end of the story, though. The break-in theory didn't quite sit right with me because of the nightmares. Nonetheless, I decided to do a quick Google search of the address to see if any similar crimes had happened in that area recently. I didn't find anything like that, but what I did find was worse. 15 years ago, a couple in their mid-40s lived there. One night, they had a fight, and the man snapped. He strangled his wife in a fit of rage, and when he came to, he threw her body in the lake to cover up what he had done. The house sat empty for a decade or so, until our Airbnb host bought it and renovated it as a vacation property. Apparently, we weren't the only ones to have that experience. A number of former guests of the property shared their stories across various online forums, all with experiences similar to mine. They seemed to believe it was the ghost of the murdered woman rising up from the lake. While I don't quite buy into that theory, I am curious to understand what may have happened there. The police never found anything to indicate a break-in, as far as I'm aware. I'm not really sure what to make of it all. What do you think? Story 10. She's Still Here. I was 10 years old in 2002 when my life was forever changed. For the past year, I had been spending more and more time with my grandmother, and we had gotten very close. That summer, she spent time teaching me some of her favorite games, like Chinese checkers. We cooked together, and she told me stories of what life was like when she was growing up. It was a summer I will never forget. One day, in early November of that year, my dad came to pick me up for our weekend together. I knew immediately by the look on his face that something was very wrong. I was sitting at the kitchen table finishing my dinner when he informed me that my grandmother was in the hospital with a collapsed lung. I dropped my fork. The food no longer tasted good, and my stomach felt sick. At this time, there was no clear diagnosis for what was wrong, and we had hope that her condition would improve, but I couldn't shake the awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. The next month was a blur. Grandma was diagnosed with lung cancer, and it was clear that she didn't have much longer with us. We spent as much time at the hospital as we could, including bringing our annual Thanksgiving feast directly to her bedside. In early December, she was released into hospice care and allowed to come home. She seemed much more comfortable at home, and it was nice to see her more at ease as she braved the battle against her illness. We didn't expect the end to come so soon. 3 days before Christmas, on the 22nd of December, I received a phone call that she had been rushed back to the hospital, and it may be the last time I was able to see her. My mom drove me to the ICU to say goodbye. The next morning, the 23rd of December, I received another call stating that she had passed. Christmas was weird that year. There was no celebration. It just seemed wrong. Instead, we met at Grandma and Grandpa's house to comfort each other, discuss funeral details, and share memories. As strange as the holidays felt while grieving, there were a couple of incidents that made it far weirder than we ever could have imagined. It started with a phone call to Grandpa a couple of days after Grandma had passed. He and my dad had been talking for a while, and Grandpa started talking about how much he missed Grandma. As he talked about missing her, the volume on Grandpa's stereo system began to turn up on its own. Grandpa assumed the dog had sat on the remote and ran to turn it down. But the dog was on the floor, and the remote was on the side table where it belonged, untouched with nothing around it. Grandpa turned the knob on the console down and brushed it off. He and Dad started talking about something else, and the stereo remained at its regular volume level. Grandpa again started talking about missing Grandma, and again the stereo's volume started to turn up. Grandpa turned it down again and checked the remote to make sure the button wasn't stuck. It appeared to be fine, but just in case, he took the batteries out of the remote until he could figure out what was making the stereo act up. When it happened a third time during the same subject of conversation, Grandpa started to get an eerie feeling about it. He later told us that he felt like Grandma was letting him know she missed him too, and showing him how much she missed him by turning the stereo all the way up to max volume. The next day was the day we all met up at Grandpa's house in lieu of the traditional Christmas celebration. We were all gathered around the kitchen island, reminiscing, when my aunt started crying and talking about how much she missed Grandma. Grandma's favorite room was the kitchen, as she loved cooking and had recently remodeled it into her dream kitchen. She had lots of trinkets in there, scattered around shelves and neatly placed along the countertops. At one end of the island sat the pressure cooker she used to cook holiday meals. It was sitting idle and forgotten this year, flanked by 2 stuffed animals that one of the grandkids had gifted to her. As my aunt sobbed, the rest of us watched one of the stuffed animals raise up about an inch or so off the island and fly across the room. We all stared at each other, completely stunned, not knowing what to make of it. After Grandpa's incident with the stereo the day before, we became convinced that Grandma wanted us to know she was still around. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Dread Weaver. I'll be back next week with more terrifying true tales. If you would like to submit a story of your own, head to our subreddit, r/thedreadweaver, or send us an email at thedreadweaver@outlook.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications if you want to hear more. Please let us know what story you think is true in the comments below. Until our paths cross again in the shadows, stay vigilant and beware the whispers of the night. This is the Dread Weaver, signing off.